Look to your left. Now look to your right. There's nobody there because we are in quarantine, but that doesn't matter because you are able to understand the words on the screen right now and the noises that I'm making with my mouth. Now, if I'd gone and put this up on the screen and said "Itario mite," you would have no clue what I was talking about because this is Japanese and you do not understand Japanese. But if I had put this up on the screen, both you and a native Japanese speaker would understand that this means Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, what's interesting is that while you might just associate KFC with lunch, a Japanese person would probably associate it with Christmas because they have the tradition of eating Kentucky Fried Chicken for Christmas dinner. Now, why is that? Memes. And when you hear the word meme, you'll probably think of something like a cute picture of a cat or a standard style top text, bottom text meme, or maybe if you're a bit younger, you'll think of something a bit more absurd. But when I hear the word meme, I think of something closer to what Richard Dawkins says in his seminal work on memetics, The Selfish Gene. And he defines a meme as a unit of cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. Now that sounds kind of complex, but really what he's just saying is that a meme is something which contains or communicates meaning. So that would include stuff like the pictures that are up on the screen right now, but it would also include things like language, political ideologies, and advertising. And that sounds really broad, and it is, because memetics is, at its core, a way to explain human interaction. Because human interaction is based on communication, and communication is based on the transfer of meaning and the transfer of messages. And that's what memetics is. It's the study of the flow of messages. And one of Dawkins' greater contributions to memetics is the idea of the memeplex. And what that is it's a meme complex. It's a collection of memes which work together to kind of survive and spread better. And you can see that really easily in something like Christianity because it's got symbols like the cross, it's got scriptures and teachings and songs, it's got traditions like Christmas. And all these things work together to make Christianity very easily understood and communicated, which is one of the reasons why it's so widespread of a religion. Its memeplex is very effective. Now, I look at the idea of the memeplex and say, cool, we can go further. And I come up with the idea that I like to call the dyad. And it further subdivides the memeplex and lets us look at how individual memes work in relation to one another. And the dyad is made up of two parts, the icon and the message. Now, an icon is what you usually think of when you hear meme, at least in the context of memetics. And it's the thing that points to a given meaning. And that meaning is the message. It's what's communicated by the icon. And you can understand that when you look at something like the Apple logo, because you see the Apple logo right there, and even though it doesn't explicitly communicate anything on its own, you understand that there are messages attached to it. You understand that it's a luxury tech brand, that it's probably going to break in your pocket, but at least you're going to look trendy and cool while you're using it. Now, this is really useful because it lets us look at real-world communities and break down how they work, and I do this with the Orange Alternative, and it was an anti-Soviet nonviolent resistance protest kind of group in Poland in the 1980s. And what they would do is they would go out and graffiti these dwarves out on walls and over government propaganda and stuff. And they would also go out in these kind of flash mobs that they called happenings. And that's where they would pull some publicity stunt like crowding a street full of hundreds of people wearing little orange hats. And they usually never explicitly had any signs or chants that could get them arrested for being dissidents, but everybody knew what they stood for. And this also let more serious groups like Solidarity come in and communicate their own anti-Soviet agenda directly. Because when the cops come in and arrest a guy for wearing an orange hat and painting a dwarf in the middle of the street in Warsaw, they look like complete buffoons. Now, you can see how the dyad comes into play here because you've got the icons of the dwarf and the happenings, and you've got the messages of anti-Soviet rhetoric. And around the two, you create a community of people who are eventually able to overthrow Soviet dominance in Poland. Now, the other really cool thing that memetics lets us do is kind of inspect and take apart something a bit more abstract and academic like postmodernism. Now, Postmodernism is a really scary word because it's full of scary French people with scary French names like Baudrillard and Derrida and Lyotard. But you can kind of condense it into a few key points. Now, postmodernism was created as a response to modernism. And according to the postmodernists, modernism is built on the idea of the grand narrative. And what that means is modernism functions around the idea that society is progressing towards some universal end goal. And common examples of that would be stuff like religion or profit or capital P progress. And this grand narrative relies on a logos, a perfect thing in itself, an objective truth. And the postmodern assertion is that the logos does not exist and that the grand narrative is ultimately a futile endeavor. Now, because the grand narrative is a futile endeavor and there is no objective truth, there is no logos, the new source of meaning becomes the subject, the self, the individual. And that's where we get the idea of subjective truth. Now, because in this environment there is no source of truth nor perfect communication, we begin to communicate in increasing layers of irony where reality kind of stops being reflected in anything we do. And that's what the postmodernists call hyperreality, because we become more and more detached from the reality in which we exist, which may not even exist at all. Now, when you look at this memetically, you can kind of see that postmodernism lacks stable dyads because it is created entirely as a destructive force. It's a refutation of modernism, but it doesn't actually create anything to replace it with. And this is kind of dangerous to community for two reasons. First, it de-incentivizes self-involvement, because why go out to this external community when instead I can turn all my relationships into this kind of mercantile pleasure seeking where I only do that which brings me the greatest net benefit. And the other thing that it does is it delegitimizes honesty, because if we do live in this state of hyperreality where the only real source of truth and meaning is myself, why be honest when I can be dishonest and instead act in the way which brings me the most benefit as an individual? And I'm not communicating with an other, I'm instead interacting with some externality that I'm using as a source of personal individual benefit. And this leaves us in this isolated state of nihilism, really, because we cannot interact with anything other than ourselves, and life becomes meaningless, really, because there is nothing to devote ourselves to. And what's really disturbing is you can kind of see this happening on the internet in the internet memes that we share, especially among young people, because you see just increasingly absurd memes which we share with each other that kind of communicate our views. We are in this state of just standing there, literally nothingness. We are in this emptiness. Of course, this nihilism hasn't completely overtaken humanity, at least as far as I can tell, and there is community which exists even in this environment of postmodernism, as you will. And I find this in things like the Toho project, specifically the Dojin community surrounding the Toho project. Now, the Toho project is just a series of games that is made by this guy called Junya Ota. He goes by Zun. And that's not so much the important part as it is what has kind of come about around his game. And that is the Dojinshi community. Now, Dojinshi doesn't really translate too well into English. If I had to give you kind of like transliteration, it would probably be something along the lines of hobby fan work, because it's a bit more structured than just hobby, but at the same time, the end goal is not so much profit as it is just the creation of something you wish to create and the interaction with other Dojin creators. Now, what's so striking about the project is that there's an insane amount and variety of Dojin content created around Toho. You've got fan games, you've got not one, but two completely fan-developed animes, you've got cosplays, you've got comics, you've got small fumos, you've got large fumos, you've got entire bands and orchestras all creating content around a single game series made by one middle-aged alcoholic Japanese guy. Now, it's able to do this because it refutes postmodernism on the two key posits around which community is formed. First, it is entirely reliant on self-involvement on the part of the Dojin creators. It is this community of individuals who are able to throw themselves at the creation of doujinshi, which creates the Dojin community. And the other thing it promotes is honesty, because doujinshi is not profit-focused, and instead it is the creation of something which I truly believe is good and should be made. And these ideas are really similar to the writings of the late David Foster Wallace and his idea of new sincerity. Now, new sincerity is Wallace's response to postmodernism, and his basic posits are that the human condition is kind of dictated by this need to worship. We need to throw ourselves at something. And to Wallace, that something is community. And because postmodernism refutes that and hides everything that we do beneath these ever-increasing layers of irony, the core of what it means to be human is really stifled by postmodernism. And in order to push back against this, we must become what Wallace calls the anti-rebel. And what the anti-rebel is the individual who's able to go against these ideas of postmodernism and throw himself, honestly involve himself in something outside of himself and find meaning in that. And if we are able to do that, then we will have been able to preserve community in a world after postmodernism. Now look to your left. Now look to your right. Now look ahead.